the intentions behind colonisation was to see the Aboriginal people and culture die out. And in many ways, we may be seeing that in front of us at the moment. It's an absolute form of racism that there's a lower expectation that we accept in terms of what's deemed as being appropriate for our Aboriginal community. They're existing at the moment in great trauma, in great pain, many of which living in fourth world abject poverty, which is going to be very difficult to turn around. History will judge us very harshly, there's no question about that. Our treatment of Aboriginal communities hasn't improved significantly across white settlement.
Why do you think that the government would want to control the Aboriginal population?
Well, Australia is built on a lie.
Gavin, you had from what I read, a difficult life growing up in housing estates and government care. You then had a child at 17 and then managed to graduate university, move to Sydney, work for an NRL team. What made you want to move to Daly River?
Daly was always something that I felt really passionate around. So I'm a career educator. I've been teaching now for 25 years, and a period of that time I was a professional rugby league referee in Sydney. So that took me down to Sydney where I was refereeing first grade in the NRL. But yeah, sort of with my background, there was a lot of love with my childhood when I look back at it, but certainly it was a pretty tough period of time. It was a single parent family, so Dad looked after the three of us, and it was a pretty tough upbringing. There was a period there where we found ourselves in government care, and at that point in time, I actually thought we were on a bit of a holiday. But yeah, so I'm the oldest I've got two younger brothers, and we were doing our best. But yeah, it was a tough childhood. But by the time I was sort of finishing high school, I had the confidence around that was a pretty tough sort of period of life that I've overcome, and it gave me great confidence that there's probably not going to be anything tougher coming in front of me. So, whilst I would never advocate probably to go through that childhood again and for others to experience that in a lot of ways, without being too harsh about it, it's certainly, I always felt as though that I was giving people around me a head start in life, and I felt like my voice probably wasn't the centre of the universe with those around me, and I was really competitive at school and quite a decent sports person, so I was really competitive, but always felt like I was giving my counterparts a head start just with the way that sort of my upbringing was as a result of my upbringing. So I really resonate with communities who also feel as though that they've been sort of marginalised or their voice isn't centred. So midway through the 2015 NRL season, I had a chat with people around me and thought that I'd finish up at the end of that year and started looking at setting down some roots in Daly River. So I moved from Marrickville in Sydney, inner city Sydney. We had a fantastic little apartment there on Marrickville Road to Daly River, which is a small Aboriginal community about 3 hours south of Darwin, with a population of a couple hundred people. So, really wanted to I felt like I'm quite privileged with the way that my life's unfolded, and now I do have a platform and a position of power, and want to make sure that I give those people who don't have a voice an opportunity to speak. And those years in Daly River have changed my life forever.
What was the initial move like from Sydney to Daly River?
Oh, look, looking back at it now, it was like, stepping into a different universe. Yeah. Daly River had just experienced a large flood, so they'd just been through a major flood event of Christmas in 2014. So the whole community had been displaced. So once we eventually got settled in, it was a fantastic community, very welcoming. You think there'd be more of a culture shock around living in one of the largest metropolitan centres in Australia and then moving to a very small remote Aboriginal community. But I had two young children at the time, and they were great icebreakers. And with my role in the school, I was sort of brought in as a behaviour management expert, and the school was in a pretty tough place at the time. So I think a combination of having two young kids who then kind of interacted with community, and my role having to deal with behaviour and talking to parents all the time, I was able to build really deep relationships quite quickly. And as a result of that, this whole other truth-telling sort of project that the community wanted to put forward came about. But very welcoming community. And given the what had happened, right across the couple of 100 years since white settlement, but even quite as late as 2007 with the Northern Territory intervention, the place was on its knees, and there'd be plenty of reasons to be quite angry with what's happened in terms of how Aboriginal community's been treated with government policy and non-Indigenous people coming in and parachuting in and taking knowledge out. But it was a beautiful community right on the banks of the Daly River, and I am indebted to that community forever. They've certainly changed my life.
How important do you think it was raising your kids? Well, do you think that it is important raising your kids in somewhere like a community compared to inner city Sydney?
Yeah, it was. And at the time, that was one of our driving forces, was to expose our two children to community life and have a freedom to their childhood that probably I didn't have and they probably weren't going to experience in Sydney. So that was one of the driving forces to go. My two older daughters, I have 4 daughters all up, so my 2 older daughters are both from the Torres Strait. So it was having those two quite young in life, which really triggered my passion and drive for to work with Indigenous communities, and with my childhood where I was certainly not a victim. I had parents who loved us dearly, but it wasn't always a fantastic sort of upbringing. But a combination of those two things really resonated with me, and I think also results now in how I work in community, and I've got a capacity to understand what people are going through who maybe don't have a voice and do feel marginalised, and then sort of bringing them on a journey to the other side of the coin where you can have a platform and be heard and make some change.
And then after Daly River, what made you come to Alice Springs?
Yeah, so midway through the first year I was in Daly's, I was just in the right place at the right time, and I developed the relationships with the community quite quickly and deeply. And at that point, they'd had enough of the government policies, and like I mentioned earlier, this constant parachuting in, taking knowledge out, and so that they were keen to do a truth telling. And the truth telling ended up forming my PhD, which I did in relationship with the community. So I started the PhD in March in 2017. It was very much a community-based study in relation to not just the participants and the way that the study came about, but even the research methodology, using Dardidi, which is a philosophy from the Nungi Kurukul people, Nungi Wurundjeri people of the region, in terms of deep listening and how you build relationships, and this thing around reciprocity, and it's a way of life. So we ended up using Dardidi as a Indigenous research methodology to frame the whole project. So it's quite unique in that way. And Miriam Rose Ungerman Bowman, who was really central to the Truth Telling project and ended up in 2021 as Senior Australian of the Year. Certainly we've done a lot of work together during that period. So I started in 2017 and completed the PhD in 2019, which then opened up the tertiary sector for me. So everything that I did with the Daly community was always to benefit that community. So once the PhD was completed, it was used as tools to talk with politicians in Canberra and the Northern Territory government. But it also opened up the opportunity for me to work in the tertiary sector. So I'm still currently a full-time employee of Charles Darwin University through the Northern Institute in the College of Education. So I'm teaching teachers how to teach, but always benefiting, in the front of my mind, or what was I doing in terms of making sure that I was benefiting the community. So there was a real relationship built between myself and the community in Charles Darwin University at that time, which has been fantastic. And I'm on a number of boards across the Northern Territory, and one of which is the Northern Territory Board of Studies. And this is how the Yprinia Alice Springs connection was made. That board, basically, there's 11 of us, and we provide guidance and counsel to the Minister of Education around providing advice around how to work with the 180 odd schools right across the Northern Territory in terms of promoting educational outcomes and the like. So I was approached at that point by a couple of people on that board to explore the opportunity to come to Alice Springs to be the principal at Yprinia. Yprinia at that point had undergone a pretty turbulent few years. In fact, it's gone through a pretty turbulent decade, to be fair, and couldn't really find a long-term principal to go forward with. So my background with education, working with Aboriginal communities, being able to sort of have a demonstrated understanding of how to develop Aboriginal leadership and governance in community. My work with the Charles Darwin University kind of was a really nice fit for Yprinia. So I ended up taking that position in October 2021, and that's been a whole journey on its own. But that's how I got to be at Yprinia in Alice Springs. And even whilst I'm here, everything goes back to how can I be moving forward the conversation for that now Yunebi community in Day River in terms of making sure they're getting what they deserve, because without them, I'm not here.
Okay. And how has it been in the school? How has it been teaching? What was it like when you first came compared to now? You said that they were going through a bit of a crisis.
Yeah, it certainly had been. So the place Yprinia was in statutory management, so the board had been sacked. I came in on the first couple of days, or term 4 in 2021. Sort of language teachers were kind of boycotting each other. There was 100 students actively enrolled at the school. They were getting 20 to 25 students right across the school per day. So from transition all the way through to year 10, we were getting 20, 25, 30 students. I remember the first couple of weeks I was here, we sort of really celebrated when we got to 40 students coming each day, and then 45 and then 50. Kids weren't coming. The place was quite colonised. Didn't really feel safe for Aboriginal people and families to belong. And I had stripped all that back, and I just stripped it back using exactly the same philosophies that was shared with me around the research piece in Daly River. So, the idea of an ancient university and the principles around an ancient university in terms of acknowledging Aboriginal worldviews at the centre of everything that we do, promoting Aboriginal leadership, promoting Aboriginal employment and training opportunities to advance Aboriginal community. So in terms of the referendum, which we've just gone through in October of last year, the ancient university actually operationalises the yes vote. We didn't need someone to come in from Canberra or have a made-up board of Aboriginal people from right across the country to speak on behalf of the Daly River community, which I know there was a very strong no vote, and also the community in Central Australia. The ancient university actually operationalised the yes. So a lot of those principles that we developed together, basically documented on behalf of the community in Daly, we just brought to Yprinia and contextualised it to this community in Central Australia. And as a result of that, as of Friday, term 1, 2024, we've got 350 active enrolments. So we've tripled the number of kids in the school. Our attendance rate has gone through the roof. As a result of that, we attract far more funding now. So, you can go to the My School website and anyone can sort of get information of what funding schools attract. So we attract around $15 million a year to do the work that we do at Yprinia based on 300 and 350 kids. So that provides us an opportunity to ensure that we come up with creative, innovative ways to deal with the trauma and the barriers that these kids experience in Central Australia, because it is significant, it is compounding, and not just in severity but also in frequency. To the point where this morning, of put 6 of our most vulnerable, at-risk teenage girls on a plane, and they're actually flying to Tasmania as we speak, because to leave them here across the holiday break would be basically writing them a ticket either into hospital or into incarceration or both, such as the dire circumstances that those girls were experiencing across the last month, with the real escalation of violence and payback in Alice Springs. So that's what got me to Yipirinya. So I'm coming up to 2.5 years at Yipi, and my goal is to stabilise culturally our staff, in terms of we've got our Aboriginal board back up and running. So they've been back on deck now for 12 months. So there's 8 Aboriginal board members, 2 from each of the 4 language groups that we have in the school, and they oversee the running of a very large organisation. I mean, more than 100 staff, and turnover, and over the next 4 years, Yipirinya will turnover more than $60 million. So ensuring that the school's got some financial stability going forward, which I'm really comfortable with. It's got a strategic plan. We've cut back all the non-Indigenous white noise that was corroding the place, and starting to think now around grooming's not the right word, but preparing a transition for me to step aside for Aboriginal principals and assistant principals to step into this role. I mean, Yipirinya is a very unique school. It's the only school of its type in the country, and it was set up by Aboriginal leaders in the 1970s for Aboriginal students. And if I'm being fair income, it should really have Aboriginal leadership sitting in the principal's chair.
What is the philosophy that you mentioned? What are the sort of driving principles behind that philosophy of education?
The ancient university, do you mean?
Yeah.
So it's around this idea of community of care and community of practice. So the philosophy is this. At the moment, we've got a very traumatised Aboriginal community population, not just in Central Australia, but wherever colonisation impacted Aboriginal community, resulted in death, genocide, dispossession, removal of families, removal of connection to culture and to country. So quite a devastating period of time, since white settlement, and we're only 7 or 8 generations since that point. So we need to acknowledge that there needs to be a truth telling there. So the first of the philosophies is we need to actually have a truth telling, and it's not to talk in a deficit narrative where victim blaming or really owning that victim status in terms of why things aren't happening in a discourse around defeat and negativity. It's about ensuring that there is a truth, a snapshot in time around what's happened to Aboriginal communities. So once that truth telling's undertaken, we can start getting to the point of healing. So healing by using traditional healing practices, not parachuting in non-Indigenous biomedical mental health modalities, if you like, but there is healing responses that exist in each of these communities. The Daly River community have their traditional healing practices in much the same way that the communities of the Central Arundel people, of the land we sit on today, have their own traditional healing practices. So if we can heal the community from the trauma, we can start then upskilling an Aboriginal workforce, which is critical in terms of changing the conversation that we're in at the moment. So upskilling an Aboriginal workforce with the knowledges that they have within the community to ensure that they take ownership of what comes next in terms of generating Aboriginal workforce, generation an Aboriginal economy, which was quite successful in a lot of communities up until the 2007 intervention, which basically pulled the rug right out of Aboriginal communities, particularly in Daly River, who had millions of dollars of surplus, an Aboriginal mayor, and Aboriginal boards, that community built its own houses, its own roads, it maintained its. So these places have quite recently demonstrated that given the right circumstances, they can fend for themselves. But we need the healing. We need then to upskill an Aboriginal workforce, and then as opposed to non-Indigenous service providers attracting the huge buckets of money. And in Central Australia, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that are attracted to non-Indigenous service providers who then work with the Aboriginal community. The money is directed straight to the Aboriginal community because we've got a healed Aboriginal community who's got a skilled workforce and have the qualifications. So when, for example, we're in an election cycle now, we've coming up to the Northern Territory election in August. We'll be having a federal election before May of next year. But the community attracts its own funding and then works with the service providers in community to drive what they think their need is and where they think their solutions are. So that our whole idea of flipping on its head the funding model in terms of how it's currently working in Central Australia and right across Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory is through the philosophy of a community of care and community of practice. And it centres Aboriginal worldviews and it's crucial that Aboriginal governance and self-determination is privileged, because what can't happen is a repeat of the self-determination years of Amanda Vanstone in the early 2000s, where we went through the assimilation era where Aboriginal communities were kind of encouraged to merge with its non-Indigenous counterparts, or die out on the country. It was one or the other. And the self-determination era came forward where the federal government said, okay, if Aboriginal communities want money and want to drive their own future, well, here it all is. And billions of dollars got pumped into communities right across the country. But there was no training, there was no healing, there was no improvement of Aboriginal capacity in terms of leadership or governance. What happened is billions of dollars got wasted. There was, huge levels of corruption. And, that was seen as a told you so moment where, federal agencies and governments right across the country, took the view that once again there needed to be this patriarchal top-down approach in terms of making sure that Aboriginal communities are dependent upon government because that's what they need.
Yep. And at the moment, it is like that?
Well, you control an Aboriginal population by having them dependent on you.
Yeah.
So and what we see at right across Alice Springs at the moment is a whole range of Aboriginal people who are addicted to sit down money, who are addicted to and totally dependent on government intervention to survive. So these 17 town camps, for example, which surround Alice Springs, are absolutely diabolical places to live, and you can control a population once they're dependent on you, and that's what we see at the moment. So, whilst there was a growing voice within non-Indigenous Alice Springs around getting Aboriginal people into work and off Centrelink, and punishing them for behaviours which don't reflect society values. In actual fact, this is a very intentional move and core piece of colonisation, because you can control a population once they're dependent on you, and that's what you're seeing at the moment.
Why do you think that the government would want to control the Aboriginal population?
Well, imagine if the Aboriginal community in Alice Springs, for example, right across the Northern Territory, actually came together as a voting bloc. That becomes a very large voice, and we need to be very clear that the intentions behind colonisation was to see the Aboriginal people and culture die out, and in many ways we may be seeing that in front of us at the moment. But there was very clear intentions. The policies from White Settlement to today has been very clear around centering non-Indigenous worldviews to ensure that there was a dying out of an Aboriginal culture, which was seen as being, Darwin would suggest, that the survival of the fittest, and it was absolutely seen, as soon as White Settlement occurred, that there should be a dying out of the weaker race, which is the Aboriginal culture, and it's the strength and resilience of the communities right across the Northern Territory that these places still exist, but they're existing at the moment in great trauma, in great pain. Many of which living in fourth world abject poverty, which is going to be very difficult to turn around.
When I came to Alice Springs, this is my second time coming here. Last time I came, I was young. I was 12 years old. I pretty much likened it to a third world place. I don't know whether you agree with that or not, but I was mind blown by the circumstances in which the people are living here. When you talk about white assimilation and the stolen generation, do you think that Aboriginal people are actively losing their culture?
Yeah, there's a corrosion here of Aboriginal culture, and it's happening in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
And there's 1,000 different metrics and measurements that you can look at to measure that. And that's a really sad comment to make. But once they're going to go back to my earlier remarks in terms of the forefathers of the settlement of white Australia, made it very clear that there was to be a dying out of this weaker race, and there was the absolute intent around government policy now for more than 100 years. The white Australia policies across the 1930s and 40s were absolutely horrendous for Aboriginal people that led to the dispossession and the genocides and the justification of the massacres and all the waves of government policy. Early on, it was poisoning water holes and poisoning flour and tea and genocides and frontier wars and the waves of government policy since then have not quite as explicit in terms of the bloody mess that it leaves on the wall once you kill a whole tribe in front of you, but the intention behind the policies still exists in terms of it was deemed to let's ensure that the strongest of the Aboriginal people will assimilate into the non-Indigenous culture and society, and the rest will die out. And that was the philosophy of the missionaries in the 60s and the 70s, and they were very close to achieving their goal, where they'd Christianise the young people, leave the old people out on country to work for free or for very little on pastoral land. And once those old people died out, then you'd had a Christianised young group of who moved that generation forward. It was only until the award wages policy from Gough Whitlam in the 70s, which mandated that everyone across the Northern Territory was and beyond, to be fair, was to be paid the same rate. At that point, two things happened. Pastoralists either couldn't pay the award wages or didn't want to pay. And in any case, those Aboriginal people who were living on country got booted off. They were basically squatting and sort of merged themselves back into the local community or the local mission, and upended the model for the missionaries in terms of that breeding out of Aboriginal culture and developing a new wave of from the Catholic missions in terms of Christianisation. But you can apply the same philosophy right across Australia. So there's a real intent behind what we're seeing, and even when you drive past, to drive from the Alice Springs Airport into the city, you drive past a dozen Aboriginal town camps, and there's just no words to describe how bad they are. There's the standard of the accommodation, the levels of domestic violence and sexual assaults, the overcrowding, the lack of food security. It's endless. We're moving into spring. We're moving into autumn now, and into the winter months. It gets below zero here quite frequently in June and July, and it's quite a harsh climate. It's a beautiful country in part of Australia, but these town camps are very, very tough places. And when we drive past them and we accept the standards that those Aboriginal families are forced to live in, and it's an absolute form of racism that there's a lower expectation that we accept in terms of what's deemed as being appropriate for our Aboriginal community, as opposed to those who are non-Indigenous in Alice Springs. And it took me a fair while to... I still feel quite uncomfortable living in Alice Springs, in the sense that when I was living in Daly River, everyone lived in the community. There wasn't a division between an Aboriginal population who are living in fourth world conditions, which is what you see in a lot of communities across the Northern Territory, particularly the town camps here in Alice Springs. But then there's a non-Indigenous sector in Alice Springs who live in $1 million houses and eating and drinking and enjoying life as you would if you were living on the North Shore of Sydney. So there's a real divide between the haves and the have-nots here. And, when I'm the principal at Ypiriniya, 350 students, almost all of them coming from the town camps or public housing estates within the city centre itself, absolute. There's just no words to describe how bad and how tough these housing situations are. And then, I get to then drive back to my place, which looks and feels very different. So still feel quite uncomfortable around that. And I'm sure it drives some of the youth crime and antisocial behaviour in terms of, kids see and feel that they've been left behind. They can see that there's people in their community, in their life, that have a very different living standard to what they have to experience, and a helplessness, with nothing to lose, with feeling left behind, feeling like you don't have a voice, that actually makes you quite dangerous. And what we've seen is across the last 18 months is a huge escalation in youth crime around kids acting out because they don't feel heard. And I absolutely think that a lot of the car stealing and the smashed windows and the antisocial behaviour, which is coming from kids as young as 8 and 10 years old, is around, this is a cry for help. I need you to listen. You're not listening to my voice. So this is a way for me to express myself. It's totally unjustified in terms of, I'm not for a moment suggesting that it's okay for 10-year-olds to break into people's homes, steal cars and drive them around Alice Springs at 1 million miles an hour. But that is a cry for help. Their behaviour is a language. They're trying to tell us something, and what they're trying to tell us is, I'm hopeless. I don't have a future. I have nothing to lose, and you're allowing me to live in fourth world poverty, and I don't like it. And this is how I'm going to express myself.
I mean, that's how revolutions happen by definition. Like, people feel like they aren't being heard, and their only way of expression of that is to revolt, is to fight back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in other places where you've got occupation of people's lands, there's guerrilla warfare, and we just have to look what's going on in Palestine at the moment. And in terms of, I mean, what we're seeing in Alice Springs is an escalation of youth crime and antisocial behaviour, which is really serious. But guerrilla warfare in other countries where the population who have been taken over and dispossessed look very different to 8 and 10 and 12-year-olds throwing rocks at windows. So once again, it's a testament of, despite that everything that's happened to our Aboriginal community in Alice Springs, they're the first ones with the olive branch. They're the first ones with the hand out going, how can we move forward together? Welcoming non-Indigenous people onto their land, into their communities. A lot of people making a lot of money and getting a lot of benefit out of the poverty and the dysfunction of Aboriginal communities in Central Australia, but still want to move forward together in a way that is welcoming and collaborative and equal and two-way. It's just, it's an extraordinary heart and compassion and resilience in community, because there'd be justification to be going, well, I've been dispossessed, my culture's been destroyed, my family's multiple, if not all of Central Australian families have some contact of the stolen generation. The frontier wars, the genocides, the wave and wave of government policy, which is just grounded down, the people who have been here for 60 or 70,000 years. So there's lots of reasons for Aboriginal people to be angry, but you don't see that, and it's a great testament to their strength.
The word or the phrase intergenerational trauma gets thrown around a lot, and it seems to me that there's a heavy disconnect between the use of the words and then the understanding from people that are hearing the word. What does it actually mean, and how does it happen?
So up until white settlement, a whole bunch of 60, 70,000 years of culture and being in the country had this seismic event when the Europeans arrived. And, let's be clear, there'd been previous contact with other parts of the world prior to Cook and Arthur and co. But what's happened there is, without repeating myself, is an absolute dispossession of a people, of a culture, of country, and that has manifested itself with trauma. And if you don't heal, what the research has found with any colonised Indigenous population, not just Aboriginal Australians, but any Indigenous colonised populations around the world, the research has found that the trauma associated with the experience of colonisation, the dispossession, the stealing of kids, the raping of the women, the erosion of culture, the genocides, the frontier wars, the massacres, is that results in trauma, and that trauma, if left unresolved, can get passed on across generations. So there's epigenetics now where you can actually map parts of the brain, and you can see that the trauma indicators physically implanted, if you like, in the bodies of all people, but we're talking Aboriginal populations here. So the experience of colonisation has led to significant trauma which has been unresolved, and that trauma unresolved part gets passed along generations, and as it does so, it increases in complexity and in severity. So whereas absolutely horrific experiences of genocide and massacres and frontier wars 200 years ago, that resulted in trauma which clearly would have been significant. The actual unresolved trauma which has been passed on for generations is actually increasing in complexity and compounding in its severity. So we're seeing now the current generation, we're 7 or 8 generations in, of that unresolved trauma that's passed across generations is now manifesting itself in community and looks like domestic violence, it looks like sexual assault, drug and alcohol abuse and dependency, an erosion of culture. And, we see that as, from an outsider looking in, if you like, particularly from a non-Indigenous perspective, around a whole community who is behaving in a way which is just not adhering to society values, not buying into economies or to schooling or to employment or to non-Indigenous culture, but looks very different in terms of dysfunction, in terms of parenting skills, the capacity to come to work and to live a life with unresolved trauma that's been passed across generations is almost impossible to achieve, particularly given what we've talked about in terms of government policy and the abject poverty that these communities live in. So until that trauma is addressed, and the first part of the trauma is to undertake a truth telling, we can't resolve it. But the Daly River story with their truth telling and through the PhD was a huge cross-section of the community who would say to me, I want to be involved, I want my truth-telling, and what I'm going to tell you, Gavin, is I haven't told anyone before. This is the first time I've ever shared this information. Horrific stories, absolutely horrific stories. But there was you had to attend to that trauma in a healing way, but also in a way that it was very educational. Once people had told their truth and learnt about trauma and learnt about the impact of colonisation, and learnt that the reason why people are behaving and feeling that like the way that they do is actually there's a real science behind it. The reason why that you're abusing alcohol, or there's this huge featuring of domestic violence or sexual assault in community is a direct linkage to the impact of colonisation. It changed the narrative in terms of people were sharing their stories in a way where they were victims, and they are victims in a lot of circumstances, and it was a sort of a deficit negative discourse. But once we changed the conversation and looked at it through the lens of, well, you're actually behaving like this and feeling this way because of colonisation and trauma, and what that trauma looks like as it gets passed across generations, people thought, you could feel that a light bulb moment where, you know, the community for the first time are going, I'm not broken. It's not about me. It's not about me being a bad person. And there's a way forward for me here. So very powerful experience to work with that community in terms of understanding what trauma is, how intergenerational trauma exists, how it evolves as it gets passed along generations, and then looking at it from a different perspective in terms of, well, I'm not broken. I'm actually not a bad person. I'm behaving in ways which I don't like. I don't like the way that I feel. I don't like the way that I'm acting, but there's a reason behind it, and it became really strength-based.
The concept of truth-telling, I'd love to hear more about that. That seems like it could be applied to not just Aboriginal people, but to people worldwide as a way of healing trauma. What do you see around that?
Well, it needs to happen, absolutely. It's complex in Australia for a number of reasons. First of all, Australia's government system, Australia is built on a lie. To gain sovereignty of a country, you do it one of two ways. You either conquer the country through force, or you come up with a treaty and you agree on terms with the new people coming in, working with the Indigenous people of the land, that this is a whole bunch of rules and giving and taking, and that's basically what a treaty results in. Australia has neither of those. So there's a significant issue in terms of, you know, the Federation of Australia in 1901, the setting up of law, of our governments, of our political systems, and how we come to be is premised on a lie. So to tell a truth around that, to do a truth telling, needs to go right back to the start, and we need to acknowledge that actually there were Aboriginal people who lived and had custom and had country and possessed the land, which was deemed to be terra nullius, which was the premise around being able to take the country without conquering and without a treaty, but totally ignoring 70,000 years of culture, which at that point in time, you know, the Europeans were quite clear about. I mean, when Arthur came back after Cook, you know, he worked out very quickly that, you know, there wasn't just one or two Aboriginal people wandering around the land, and, you know, people owned country, and, you know, once they moved, you know, out of botany and abroad, and the frontier people moved, you know, far quicker and more broadly than even he would have liked, it became very clear that there was Aboriginal people right across the country who lived there for a very long time. So, you know, we need to address that, and, you know, as we've seen with the recent referendum, we are not at a time in our history that we're going to have a mature enough conversation to talk about that. The other complexity is around many of our forefathers, our great-grandfathers, our great-great-grandfathers were part of frontier, you know, the settling of Australia, and what was accepted and what was deemed to be the treatment of Aboriginal people now is classified as a genocide or massacre behaviour or crimes against humanity. You know, the raping and stealing of women and killing of children, and, you know, Blackfella Creek in Daly River, for example, which, you know, the community would say that, you know, there was 25 or 30 women and children who were getting chased by a punitive party, which was state-sponsored, mind you. The men were fast enough to flee on foot, but the women and children, you know, jumped into what is now known as Blackfella Creek, just on the drive into Daly River. I mean, a total massacring of women and children. You know, we've got, you know, current decision makers in Australia have lineage to people who've done things in the past which hasn't been amazing. You know, the killing of people, the chopping off our Aboriginal ears and nailing it to the wall. You know, there's people who hold positions of power right across Australia who have ancestors who've participated in stuff which isn't great. So a truth-telling positions people currently in Australia, and whether they're in a position of power or not is irrelevant, but if you're going to have a truth-telling, you need to convince those in power that it's a great idea. And at the moment, those in power have probably ancestors who have done things that, if brought to light now, would be deemed as absolutely inappropriate. Right. So truth telling in that sense, we're a fair way off from a nation's point of view. But more and more Aboriginal communities are feeling empowered enough and brave enough now, and the daily experience, it was partly about their truth telling, it was partly about documenting their story, because the impact of colonisation is that great, and the erosion of knowledge is happening that quickly that they wanted to document what had happened to them before those old people passed, and so there is a movement towards individual sort of small scale truth telling. Victoria's, some of the groups in Victoria have undertaken that process, but it's quite individual, and it's small scale, and it's certainly not informing any sort of government policy development or reform. But our truth telling is a long way from coming forward for the reasons I've just mentioned.
How is history going to look back at us? You mentioned briefly before we started recording that we'll be seen the way that we look at people in the past. How do you think that in 50 years' time will be perceived?
History will judge us very harshly. There's no question about that. Our treatment of Aboriginal communities hasn't improved significantly across white settlement. It just looks different and sounds different today. The celebration, for example, of the massacres on the front pages of the Northern Territory Gazette. It was the South Australian. We were part of South Australia at that point, but it was claimed as being a moment of celebration that Aboriginal communities were massacred, or punitive parties went out and found retribution against Aboriginal people who killed a pig, or stole some stock, or a bull, or were deemed to have wronged the European population of the time. To go out and to kill and to maim and to rape and to dispossess was a moment of celebration, and we look back at that language now, with great disgust, and so we should. But we can't. When you're looking at history, you need to be very careful that you're not judging previous times with your current standards, because to go to your question, in 50, 100 years' time, we're going to be looking back. Australia will look back at us today with the disgust in the same way that we look back 50, 100 years ago around the language and the treatment of Aboriginal people. It hasn't got any better. It just looks different. Us walking past and accepting the living conditions, the rheumatic heart disease, the scabies, the amount of preventable diseases which Aboriginal people continue to live with in escalating frequency, which other parts of Australia now is totally done away with, and it's just accepted as being par for the course. And this reverse racism around low expectations for Aboriginal people will be how will be remembered. And the closing the gap measures, which is put forward by the Productivity Commission, every year, where those 19 measures, most of them are widening in terms of a response moving forward, as opposed to any closing of any gaps. So, yes, that you can point to diamonds in the rough and different parts of our Aboriginal community right across the Northern Territory, which is doing well and moving forward and strengthening culture perhaps and strengthening language perhaps. But the overwhelming feel here is that as we lose one old person after the next, and there's been some significant ones in the last 12 months in Alice Springs, we're another step forward towards losing an Aboriginal culture and language and knowledge system, which will eventually die out.
We've talked in depth today about the external forces pushing Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities down. I want to know what your perspective is on sort of the problems internally. You mentioned in your PhD that there's been a sort of erosion of male elder leadership. What's the impact of that, and what are some of the other internal problems that they face?
So there was a very sophisticated knowledge system and way of being which Aboriginal communities had developed and refined over a very, very long time. One of which was the role of the Aboriginal male, and they were the traditional law keepers in community, and they were the ones who applied traditional law in a way that, for example, a great example at the moment is, what's deemed as payback in the contemporary Alice Springs in 2024 and the corruption of that traditional law. So one of the really significant impacts of colonisation has been the disempowerment of Aboriginal male elders, and they were the law keepers. So but basically what you've just done there is you've just totally disempowered half an Aboriginal population, and probably the most significant part in terms of law. Traditional law was so sophisticated. It was done in a way. Payback, for example, was done in a way to keep the waters calm, to make sure there wasn't any escalation of any significant confrontation or warfare between groups and between tribes across Australia. And it was done in a way and led by Aboriginal male elders in a way through, through ceremony, through songlines and song and dance and food. There was a ritual around it, and it was done to keep things calm and peaceful, and to make things right. And you went through that process. The payback was applied, if you like, and then across the next period of time, things had settled and people move on. The disempowerment of Aboriginal traditional law keepers today have meant that there's this vacuum. There's a vacuum in traditional law. There's nothing strong and consistent and stable coming from traditional Aboriginal men, and non-Indigenous policing and law keeping hasn't really impacted in any way to change any sort of behaviours which are deemed to not meet non-Indigenous societal values. I mean, the fact that we've got 2,500 people in Alice Springs in Northern Territory prisons as of today, 40% of them on remand, and a huge percentage of them Aboriginal people. Every single child in detention in the Northern Territory Aboriginal people. There's this grey area. There's a lawlessness, a greyness around law keeping now in Central Australia, in Alice Springs, where the Aboriginal traditional male had their purpose and their roles taken off them and replaced with nothing. And what we're seeing now is payback on the streets of Alice Springs, which looks like gangland street violence from America, and recorded on mobile phones to be perpetrated and spread near and far on social media platforms. And just in the last 3 weeks, we've had some really significant escalations in payback, and it's a total corruption of traditional law, and it's a result of the impact of colonisation on the traditional male elder.
What can the average person do to help?
In terms of
just in terms of being there for Aboriginal people, hearing their stories. I assume that most of the work that needs to be done is going to come from government policies and real change in that regard. But what is the average person that sees this living in Alice Springs or living in Darwin or maybe even living in Sydney? What can they do to actually put their foot forward and do something rather than feeling guilty or feeling sorry for these people?
I think the first step is to get educated. Even myself, who've went through the PhD process with Della River, got two Indigenous children who are both a quarter of a century old. The more I learn about Aboriginal culture and the history and the impact of colonisation, the more I realise I really don't know much about it at all. And given my experience and the journey that I've been on, I talked with people right around Australia, decision makers, policy makers, people responsible for reform, aspiring school teachers who have never seen an Aboriginal person, don't know how to interact with Aboriginal culture, and it's that lack of education and exposure and being with Aboriginal people in a way that is transformative and authentic is a significant problem for the broader Australia, because unless we become educated, we really can't move this conversation forward. And you can't be expecting people, for example, I mentioned the election cycles which we are now in. These measures and living standards and the impact of colonisation of Aboriginal communities should actually inform government policy in a way where Aboriginal people can vote as a bloc, but more broadly, we've got a non-Indigenous voting bloc who understands the plight of Aboriginal communities to get to this point in 2024. Because without that, we're not really informed when we go to the ballot box, and whether we like it or not, that's how significant reform gets put forward. And what we've seen up until now is non-Indigenous people holding power, holding the levers of Aboriginal communities in terms of self-determination, Aboriginal leadership, growing economies in Aboriginal communities, and until we get a non-Indigenous body, group of people, population, which actually understands what's going on, firstly around Aboriginal culture to get to this point, but what's going on in community today, help won't be, first of all, help won't come, and secondly, when it does come, it won't be useful. And the last thing Alice Springs needs at the minute is a whole range of non-Indigenous, frangipani throwers, if you like, who romanticise about what they think Aboriginal culture is or should look like, or the very small interactions they've had with Aboriginal culture forms their understanding of what they, in their own heads of what they think life should be like in Central Australia. And you can take that as an observation or a criticism or both. But, those sorts of people who are ill-informed or not informed at all, who then are placed in positions of power to make decisions on behalf of Aboriginal populations, really is hurting the cause and sending backwards any sort of opportunity for progress in terms of closing the gaps, for example. So, whether we look at initial teacher education programs at university level to ensure our teachers have an understanding of all of what I've just described today. So they've got some understanding of how they can incorporate that into a curriculum that is fair and balanced and truthful. How we go about doing that. So we've got a generation of young people coming one after another that are more informed than the last, because the first few generations of non-Indigenous Australians didn't have a great understanding of Aboriginal people. The missionaries, basically rounded up Aboriginal people as if they were all one group or all of one tribe or all of one language, of a dying race where there was no real understanding of connection to country. Aboriginal people were just nomads who wandered around the country in small and dwindling numbers. That was Banks and Cook and other, that was the information that was getting fed back to England in those times. So there was a clear misunderstanding and lack of education and information at that period, and we haven't really gone that far forward in terms of educating our Australian population in a way where we can start pulling levers which are going to make a difference in community.
Thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited to see where this school goes and where your future goes. I'm grateful that you're actually making an impact in this community, and thanks so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks.